Yep, we're live. All right, cool. Yeah, sorry, we had to change the link. Hello, everyone. I think I'm gonna need more. I think almost all my entire audience is gonna be familiar with your work, Dan Williams. I'm probably gonna need more of an audience or more of an introduction. I don't want your audience to assume that I necessarily mirror the same calm academic prose that you do. I fully acknowledge that I have some of my writing is deranged and unhinged, kind of intentionally so. In some instances, we'll talk about that soon. But for those that don't know me, I'm the token public defender among radicalist circles. I write about all sorts of random shit. Mostly politics. Talk about language. I've been writing a lot about Israel Palestine lately. It's just kind of or stories from the law, whatever kind of comes up. I'm a big fan of your Substack, Dan. You have been a mollifying presence inside my brain by addressing some of the concerns and hysteria surrounding misinformation and social media and our loony new epistemic landscape. So I'm very excited to talk to you. Hello.
Hey, and likewise.
Cool. So there's like a few things that we can talk about. Um, maybe there's a question that I've been dying to get your opinion on. And to set the stage, I have some very strong disagreements with American conservatives on a whole range of policy issues, but some of the grievances that they cite, I'm very sympathetic to. And they largely fall under the penumbra of distrust of experts. I think it's perfectly fine as a principle to be distrustful of experts. I think it's especially warranted and a near obligation when an institution showcases itself to have some debilitating deficiencies in how it reaches its expert opinion. So we can go through the gauntlet of issues. If we start at a high level, we can talk about academia as a whole and the problems that it has. The one that really gnaws on me is just the inaccessibility of language, where they have a very banal observation, but the incentive structures of the institution encourage you to dress up your banality in inaccessible prose to make it sound like you have something profound. That really bothers me. I think it's beyond obvious that there's some sort of ideological capture on a variety of issues. The things that stand out would probably be, at least like culture war issues in America, would be trans healthcare for minors. That would be an example where I think the skepticism towards institutions is valid. I am very pro vaccines. I thought a lot of the COVID lockdown restrictions were valid to a point. So I also share some agreement with the conservative grievances that they think some instances went too far. The part that I break with them is if I'm able to repeat or affirm some of the grievances that they have, my solution isn't to, start listening to Candace Owens about what she has to say.
Right.
So the question I've been dying is, am I just better than everyone else? Like, what's the what's the explanation here?
Wait, sorry, what was the connection between everything that you said up until the last sentence and that last question?
So I think there's valid distrust of institutions for valid
Oh, I
reasons,
see. I see what you mean. Right. Yeah, sorry, I'm with you.
but the proposed remedy by some people, not everyone, but especially among conservatives, is don't trust the media, trust this random podcaster instead. Uh,
Right,
you know,
yeah.
I don't trust what the CDC has to say, therefore I'm going to listen to Candace Owens talk about Brigitte Macron's penis, something to that effect. So, like, what do you think is the best explanation for that?
Yeah. Phew, that's like a whole can of worms. There's so much complexity there. I mean, I think you make a good point, which is some people try to explain the sorts of misinformation, conspiracy theories, and so on that you find with the right wing populist space, MAGA space specifically in the US, but I think you see some similar issues with sort of the information environment of right wing populist movements throughout the world. They try to explain the emergence of that as a response to the objective failures of establishment institutions and the expert class and so on. And clearly, there's something there in as much as people who belong to that information environment, whether they're listening to Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, but just more broadly within that kind of space, they will often cite institutional failures as a justification for their preferred information sources and for the kinds of views that they advance. But you're right, there's something a little bit strange about that because even if you think that there have been really serious objective failures, epistemic failures, as it were, when it comes to the performance of these institutions and the expert class and so on, they just pale in comparison to what's happening with figures like Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson. Also, I'd argue Elon Musk as well. That whole kind of right wing MAGA information environment, even if you think there are all of these issues with the expert class, they're nowhere near as bad as what you're finding on that part of the political spectrum. So it would be strange in a way to cite the failures of these institutions as a justification for opting for that alternative information environment. I
So
think that's
we can
correct.
split maybe we can split the response in two fields. One is obviously there's going to be a marketing angle for influencers when they present
Right.
themselves as I'm supposed to be your alternative to mainstream media. Look at all the things mainstream media is wrong about. I'm not concerned about that marketing angle.
Mm,
It's and also part of it is I guess the audience tells themselves this story potentially. The
right.
part that gnaws on me is like, why do they even like sustain? Why do they even make the jump from listening to one source to another? Like, what exactly is the draw that makes them shift?
Yeah, I mean, I think one good question is, I mean, how big is the segment of the population that once listened to these establishment institutions and now listens to figures like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens? I suspect that a large segment of the audience for Candace Owens consists of people who were always pretty hostile towards these establishment institutions. I think there are some people that have flipped over, but in general, I think that people like Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson, they're catering to a sort of segment of the population that has got sort of deep rooted, long standing hostility towards establishment institutions, in part because these establishment institutions make knowledge claims which just violently conflict with the intuitions and preferred narratives of large segments of the population. So if you're already highly conspiratorial in terms of the way that you view the world, you're going to be resistant to the kind of content you're getting in mainstream media and the kind of content you're getting from public health authorities and universities, just because there's a kind of obvious conflict between the two. Now, some people have sufficient trust in these institutions that they're willing to abandon those conspiratorial intuitions and give them up. But I wonder when we're talking about people like Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson, I mean, you're going to be much more familiar with this than I am, but I wonder how many of them fall into that category of once having the trust and now losing it, as contrasted with a case where they always dislike these institutions. And people like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens are just very good at catering to that segment of the population. I genuinely don't know, but I think it's
So
definitely. Yeah, go
part
on.
of it
Sorry.
is when we're talking about the scope of the problem. I think you and I are in alignment on a broad range. So I don't want to presuppose your
Mm,
beliefs, but um, I think we're in agreement that there is an epistemic problem within American conservative right.
right,
Correct? Right.
hundred
And
percent.
so I'm not talking about just pure audience numbers, like how many listeners does Candace Owens have. Um, that can occupy its own sphere. The fact that I think undeniably translates into electoral success in America is some sort of evidence that it's much more of a problem than just who listens to what podcast.
Mm.
This exists in the real world, and in other words. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but then I would say that you're right. There's this general phenomenon where the right has become increasingly estranged from and hostile to establishment institutions. sort of mainstream legacy media, public health authorities, universities, and so on. I think that's true. And then there's a question about
And
why that has
just to
happened.
add, for good reason on a large part, a large range of topics.
Well, you might think, as we said, there are these objective institutional failures, and I agree with you on many of those. So it's not as if there's no reason to have some significant degree of skepticism about these institutions. I do think there's a question about the degree to which that's actually caused this political division, right? I think there are probably other forces that are at play, and this is getting
Sure.
used as a sort of post hoc justification
Yes,
for the estrangement and for the hostility. And I
I
think
agree.
evidence for that is precisely that they're cherry picking these cases of institutional failures, which are often very real. But those failures, as I mentioned, I think pale in comparison to the failures that you find with their preferred information sources. So I don't think it's a very
I
compelling
agree.
explanation.
I'm
Um,
not presenting it as a compelling explanation. I'm just kind of tossing a bone. Like
no, I
I'm not
get
going to
that.
claim
Yeah,
that
that's really
all of the
important.
grievances are wrong. And so yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with these trends that go back, decades now of, um, on the one hand, just increasing partisan polarization in the US, where Republicans and Democrats just increasingly hate each other, but the way in which that maps onto educational polarization, where people with college educations, 4-year college education or postgraduate education, highly educated professionals, increasingly being left, have, especially on social issues, very kind of culturally, socially progressive views. And they increasingly staff these prestigious institutions, right? Because you need that credential to rise up the ranks. Whereas socially conservative Americans without college education have increasingly become the base for the Republican Party, in a way that wasn't true if you go back sort of 20 years. And I think from the
Mhm.
perspective of sort of conservatives, if you're socially conservative and you don't have college education, you're going to look at these institutions and they're going to be staffed with people who don't have your partisan identity, that belong to a social class that you perceive, in many cases accurately, as looking down upon you. And I think that then is really not hospitable um, territory for things like trust, right? So why would it be the case that if you've got people that feel they're being looked down upon by educated elites with alien progressive values, where it's kind of obvious that those progressive values are influencing the behavior of these institutions, why would you trust them? So you don't have that institutional trust, but then there are other figures that come along and they're totally distinct from these institutions. And this could be among politicians, people like Donald Trump, but it can also be among media figures. And not only do they sort of cater to the intuitions, the attitudes of this less educated, socially conservative base, but they also sort of articulate a narrative about the world, which I think is designed to enhance the perceived status of that segment of the population. Right. So someone like Tucker Carlson, someone like Candace Owens, Donald Trump himself, they come along and they tell a narrative where actually these sort of progressive dominated institutions, they're irredeemably corrupt, right? They're filled with these liberal elites who are, in some versions of this narrative, like literally demonic or satanic once you get to the real
Mhm.
kind of conspiratorial aspects. Um, so you get this sort of demonization of the people that they're hostile towards, but you also get this valorization of things like gut instincts, common sense, conspiracy intuitions, which I think resonate with many people. So I think that's obviously a very simplistic and compressed story, but I think that's a lot more of what's going on than, oh, these institutions fucked up, people lost trust, and so they started listening to fringe figures on the right. I think it's more to do with these more deep rooted patterns of political realignment, especially along educational lines, and then the ways in which
Right.
that has politicized institutions and the reputation of those institutions.
So I see like two potential responses to if you're correctly identifying. I'm just going to stipulate that there is a valid crisis of institutional trust. There's two avenues, the two that you can use to respond. One, you can build something better.
Right.
The second one is to use it as a pretextual excuse and just kind of reaffirm your tribalism, or
Mm.
like use it as as that. So the fact, the way I would like present this argument is the fact that there haven't been serious efforts to build something better, make it emphasize that the better explanation is the second one. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would have thought so. And I should say it's something that I've changed my mind about. So a few years ago, I was very inclined towards this. Misinformation on the right is in large part symptomatic of institutional failure. Like you, I do think institutional failure is real, and I do think that it plays at least some role. But for these sorts of reasons, I don't think it's the major driving force. I think there's also like a question about whether institutional failures, however you unpack that term, are actually worse now than they were in the past anyway. That's, I think, in and of itself a complex question. I mean, if you go back to things like, the Iraq War, you might think about like the financial crisis as a certain kind of establishment failure. I mean, these were pretty bad fuck ups, and they didn't seem to produce the same kind of anti-establishment backlash that you're finding today, which suggests it's not the sort of objective magnitude of the failure. It's something to do with the way in which that failure co-occurs now with institutions that are perceived as being politicized, and also perceived as featuring this kind of highly educated professional managerial social class that just looks down upon and has a very condescending attitude towards the MAGA base. And I should say, I mean, I'm not putting the blame on people within these institutions. I am myself a kind of highly educated professional within an academic institution. I think there's just a kind of doom loop thing going on, right? Whereas now, if you are one of these institutions and you look at, say, the MAGA base, or more broadly, the kind of information environment, if you're a smart, educated person, what are you actually to think when you come across millions of people listening to Candace Owens with just the most deranged,
Yeah.
psychotic conspiracy theories, or someone like Trump just, lying with a kind of frequency and brazenness, which, irrespective of what your political views are, it's going to be very difficult to go along with that if you're an educated, thoughtful person. And then in response to that, I think the base, the kind of right populist base, gets even more this feeling that they're being condescended to and they're being looked down upon. And so that then inflames that division even more. And so they become even
Hmm.
more receptive to narratives that will demonize those institutions. And you just get this kind of doom loop where it just looks to be getting worse and worse and worse. It's very difficult to know what you do about any of that. But I think it's a much more complicated story than the institutions messed up, people lost trust, and so you get bizarre right wing conspiracy theories. I think it's a lot more sort of complex how that actually played out.
Yeah, I think we're in agreement about this. The I guess the secondary, a follow-up question is why do we just blame the doom loop itself, or is there something else that would, I don't know, inspire or instigate this reaffirmation, this need to dive down and double down on your tribalism cue? Is there something else that is propelling that or motivating it, or is it just random?
I don't think it's random, and I think people are sort of responding to their incentives, their immediate incentives. But it would be better in a way if people understood the situation and then step back. So I think even though I don't think, say, objective failures of institutions is the main thing that is driving this, I think it's one thing. And so I think if you belong to one of these institutions, it is really important to try to build up healthier, better institutions. I also think the politicization of many of these institutions and the degree to which there's a kind of liberal, progressive groupthink, that is a contributing cause to some of these issues. And I think that's the kind of thing that you should want to address if you're part of these institutions. I also think, I mean, we might talk about this, and I think, and I know you've written about this, but my view is even though this tribalism is real, and even though these sorts of social divides are real, I think rational persuasion is still possible to some extent if you actually try to meet people where they are and you try to present evidence and arguments. You won't reach everyone, and there are some people who are just complete lost causes. But I think as a
Hmm.
strategy, that's kind of underrated, not least in a world where so much. especially sort of progressive discourse now basically features in institutions or in the social media platforms like Blue Sky, where it's not reaching anyone outside of the bubble, and vice versa. I think you're getting these sorts of right wing information spaces where there's no real attempt to persuade people across the aisle. Now,
That
it's understandable. Go on, sir.
there is a deficiency of attempts to persuade. The problem I run into is, so we were talking about the doom loop. I'm old enough to remember what happened 20 years ago and kind of like the Cultural War battles around the Iraq
Mm,
War. There was a lot of disdain among liberals that looked down on conservatives as, dumb hicks or dumb rednecks, which at the time I would say I was like, I don't know, mildly more aligned to the left. I thought that uh, backfire, but now it's like hard for me. I admit, like it's hard for me to say it's unfair when I see kind of like the opinions are circulating, not just among random people on Facebook, but from elected officials that are either part of the MAGA base or trying to cater their message to the MAGA base. And by the way, like obviously I have a lot of grievances with aspects of the left that repeat some of these phenomenon. Um, the part, I guess, the schism for me is that if we go back 20 years ago, I've written about this multiple times. I would have disagreements with Republican policies, like the Iraq War was my political awakening, my disagreement with it. But at least I could map what they believed in. I as the I wouldn't say that they were random. It was based on faulty information, maybe overconfidence in their assessment. But I could at least tell you what their values were. Nowadays, it's becoming harder and harder to do that, and this is true for both the right and the left. And an example is I had a conversation with someone that was voting for Trump. I can't even say this without laughing, but he did it to support free speech, which is like just gets more and more hilarious as more months go by. And the feeling that I get, the overwhelming one that I feel, is just disorientation, where I wish the best that I can wish for is for me to truly understand and be able to repeat someone's position back at them and for them to say, yes, that's why I believe. And I don't mean just like asserting the position, but explaining, here are my values, here are my premises, and here's how it connects to my current beliefs. It's so I don't even know where to start with when a Trump supporter says they support Trump because of free speech. I'm just confused because I think, are they deluding themselves? Are they just stupid? Did they get? Are they trying to delude me? There's this loss of anchor that makes it very hard to even chart out a plan.
yeah. Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I think that's an interesting case, right? So people that supported Trump and maybe still support Trump on these free speech grounds. I mean, my suspicion there is, I mean, so there are some people who are just uh, partisan fanatics and apparatchiks, and you're just never going to reach them. And I think you find that on both sides. But my suspicion with that case is many people have an entire background set of beliefs about the world, about the Biden censorship industrial complex as they see it, about cancel culture, about et cetera, all of these cases that are governing how they're perceiving things. And that's built up over a long time, thanks to the kind of information that they're getting, the sources that they're consulting. And then when it comes to, egregious violations of the principles of free speech that you're finding from Trump, they're either just not particularly aware of it, or it's being framed in such a way that they don't recognize how bad it is. So if you speak to someone with that worldview, and you try to persuade them, I don't think you should conclude from the fact that you can't change their mind right there and then, or it's going to be hard to change their mind, that it's impossible to change their mind. I think it's just going to inevitably be a very slow process, because they're going to be approaching this topic through the lens of this vast network of background beliefs. So you can be talking
Yeah,
about a specific thing. Yeah,
I wouldn't
sorry.
say it's impossible. Obviously, I wouldn't say it's impossible to change their mind. I just I don't even I don't know what I'm working with. I don't even know where to start, because if you're ascribing their loony beliefs to this vast network, like what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to create my own vast network and then hope that it it like jury rigs in the correction that I want it to. I'm I have trouble just being a cartographer in this environment.
Yeah, but I was using that just to illustrate that sometimes it can feel like persuasion and attempts of persuasion are futile when actually they're just really difficult because you're going up against a lot. Um, and that's not to say that everyone should be going out and just trying to present rational arguments at all time. But I do think just purely presenting people with evidence and arguments is really underrated as a strategy.
I
And I
agree.
think a lot of the belief about how it's sort of not going to work or it's not going to be impactful, I think is an understandable response to the fact that when you encounter someone with just a totally different set of background expectations, priors, as people like to say, um, it's going to seem like it's really difficult, if not impossible, to persuade them just because you're not just trying to change one belief. It's like you're trying to gradually make a dent on this whole package of beliefs. And that's to say nothing of the fact that, people's pride is often wrapped up with the positions that they've taken. So then there's a whole kind of reputational thing where people don't want to admit that they're wrong. And then in addition, the fact that if they come out and change their mind, they're probably dimly aware of the fact that they might lose friends over it, or it might sort of make them less approved of within their political group. All of that stuff is real and it explains why persuasion is really, really difficult. But I think, nevertheless, there's good reason to think that if you really work at it and you make an effort over a period of time to give people evidence and arguments without just sort of insulting them, you can make a difference. Maybe that's excessively optimistic, but
No, yeah, you picked up. There's like so many points I want to go down to. So, similar to like our echoing our earlier theme, we can't. I agree that there's not enough persuasion attempts, but we also can't blame the current epistemic environment on the lack of persuasion, right? What do you
I think
think?
it's one factor. I think it's one factor.
Right.
I think that the fact that it's underrated, rational persuasion, I think it does have deleterious consequences. But no, I don't think it's the only thing going on, or even like the biggest thing going on. There are all of these other forces to do with like status conflict and who people trust and tribalism. All of that stuff is real. But I'm just saying,
Hmm.
at the margin, can you make a difference for the better if you, I don't mean you specifically, if one makes a conscious, deliberate attempt to try to change people's minds? I'm inclined to think that that can make a positive difference. But yeah, it's
Yeah.
not going to solve all of the issues.
Yeah. And so I think one of the points that you keep coming back to is that the fringe has always existed. Uh, it's not. I tell me if I'm wrong. In paraphrasing you, but you don't believe that social media has increased it. It just made it more visible. Is that correct? Is that accurate?
Uh, I mean, I wouldn't put things that sort of strongly just because I think there's an enormous amount of uncertainty. I mean, the way I would put it is I think people underestimate the degree to which what social media is doing is exposing you to views that have kind of been there all along. There's interesting research by Joe Yasinski about how if you look at surveys of like conspiracy theory belief, at least in the research that he's done and talking to him, he doesn't think that overall rates of conspiracy belief have increased among the mass public. They've always been really high, those rates, surprisingly high when it comes to many of these beliefs. But obviously, one of the things that social media does is it now exposes a segment of the population that was previously shielded from these widespread conspiracy theories to them. And I think that can create the illusion that social media has kind of ushered them into existence, or social media is responsible for why these beliefs have become really prevalent, when a lot of that, I think, is no, they were all already prevalent. But now, because of social media and this kind of democratizing feature of social media, they're just much more visible than they would have been otherwise. And just
Yeah,
more
I
generally, I
agree.
think, just one final thing, I think people just underrate the extent to which in general, people have believed wild stuff throughout human history. So we see a lot of this
Yes.
now. People think, oh, now it's a misinformation age. Now it's a conspiracy theory age. Now it's post truth and so on. And then they're neglecting the degree to which, uh, in some ways, the surprising thing is the fact that there are people today who have, like, broadly speaking, evidence based kind of scientific worldviews. If you look at the broad sweep of human history, Manichaean, conspiratorial, pre-scientific narratives are the norm. And it's
Mhm.
this other thing that actually I think is the aberration.
Yeah, I think it's very important to keep that context in mind. I used to work doing IT support in the House of Representatives. Like this is a long time ago,
Oh,
and so
interesting.
I would see the letters that staffers would have to throw away, and back then it was much harder to communicate to your representative. You have to take out a letter, and it would just be deranged stuff that was done by clearly mentally ill people. Like they
Right.
would circle numbers on newspapers and like draw connections to them. They would include photos with all their eyes crossed out, things like that. It's like this is just schizophrenia. But now it's you can put it out to the void. You can get affirmation. You can make millions of dollars a year repeating it to an audience. There's the internet connected us, allowed us to connect together, which meant also that crazies are able to connect to each other. So I agree with you that we shouldn't like assume that it's necessarily being created, and we should remind ourselves that they've always exist. One of the I think mainstays of research into electoral politics, maybe not exactly that, but you always assume that voters are going to be erroneous or have some crazy beliefs in some direction. But one of the um, satisfying assumptions that they would cancel each other out. Like you'd have crazy
Mm.
beliefs that would randomly take you into a right wing direction or into a left wing direction, and the votes kind of cancel out to each other. Do you think that dynamic has materially changed?
Oh, great question. What do you think? I feel like there's a behind that question, there's a viewpoint.
Um, I mean, I can point to crazy or what I think is craziness on both the right and the left. And it's hard to explain just how one, at least from like the narcissistic American perspective that dominates the world, why one party would become kind of the default cache or the default home for conspiracy theorists. It seems
Mm.
like maybe Trump just tapped into something that was compelling within American culture, and that's how people got galvanized to kind of switch into one side. And again, I'm not going to claim that left wing has no conspiratorial tendencies. It just feels extremely imbalanced when it's emphasized by not just the random people but also the leadership class. So I would say no, it doesn't cancel out. There's to me there's a clear conservative bias to the prevalency of conspiratorial thinking.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting, and I think that connects with, what Matt Iglesias calls like the crank realignment. The
Hmm.
fact that it used to be the case that people with, certain kinds of really just unintelligent conspiracy theories that existed, but they were sort of randomly distributed between the parties.
Yes.
And then I think, in part as a consequence of what we were talking about with sort of educational polarization, where the Democrats have become the party of highly educated urban, professional, kind of progressive technocrats, loves institutions, trusts the experts, etc. Whereas the conservatives have become, or the Republicans rather, have become the party of kind of socially conservative individuals without college education who don't trust institutions. Um, that means that, well, the kinds of people that don't trust institutions and typically don't have kind of formal education, I think they tend to be much more conspiratorial. But I would say,
Hmm.
I think what's interesting is you might think like these two ways of forming beliefs are sort of associated with different failure modes. So on the
Yes.
right, it's like the the mistakes, the false beliefs, the absurd worldviews. They're just sort of outright demonstrably false nonsense in most cases, right? Whereas I think once you've got lots of highly educated professionals as the base of a party who, quote unquote, trust science and trust the experts and so on, you also get certain kinds of distinctive epistemic or intellectual failures. They're just very different in kind. So I think you're going to get a lot
Hmm.
less of, oh, those people over there are like Satan worshipping, cannibalistic pedophiles. You're not going to get like those kinds of conspiracy theories, but you're still going to get like many of the forces that bias and shape ideology and belief systems. It's just going to be
Yes.
couched in a different kind of language and a different set of sort of concepts and methodologies. That's not to draw an equivalence. Like I think we agree that if you look at sort of the mainstream Democratic Party today and mainstream Republican Party, the latter is just a lot worse. But I think we also agree that uh, um, that doesn't imply that there are no problems when it comes to the mainstream liberal, mainstream left. part of the political spectrum. I'm saying we agree, but you can feel
Yeah, yeah,
free
no,
to.
no, I think we agree. I guess we're trying to like dig at to find. I'm just trying to make sense of the shifting, ever shifting landscape. One thing you brought up is this is going to sound like a dumb question, but why is it hard to admit error?
Yeah. Um, I think it's hard because, I mean, maybe there's not only one reason, but one big reason why it's difficult to admit error is because um, people feel like they'll be perceived negatively for it. Um, like they've not been sufficiently careful in how they form their beliefs, so they feel like their reputation is tied to the positions that
Hmm.
they've endorsed. So if they have to come out and say, "Oh, I was just completely wrong," I mean, it feels painful, I think, for these sorts of reputational reasons. But I should say, I mean, I do think that's it's sort of contingent to use a like philosophical term in the sense that I think there are some healthy cultures or subcultures that manage to get rid of that norm where actually they celebrate admitting that you're wrong and they celebrate the
Hmm.
acknowledgement of uncertainty. I think you can find that, and I think when you do find that, you have much better, much healthier information spaces. I just don't think that's the default when most contexts people's pride feels like it's connected to what they're
Yeah,
saying. I don't know.
th-
That's off the
this
top
is
of my
a
head.
I'm gonna see if you know like any context or relevant research, but this is a question that makes me feel the most like an alien, because
Mm,
I consider myself egotistical, narcissistic to a degree, in that I think
right.
very highly of myself. I mean, because I have good evidence to believe that, and admitting error doesn't make me feel like this kind of like risible like clenching in my chest, like, oh God, I'm gonna do it. It it's like just saying, oh, like the sky is blue. I made a
Mm,
mistake, and here's how I made that mistake. Because at least you know, I recognize I'm an outlier, but at least my operating philosophy is I don't want to be wrong, right? I want to be
mm,
correct. And the way to do that is by constantly introspecting on your premises, on your reasoning, on your beliefs. And when someone tells me, "Hey, you're wrong about this," I genuinely feel earnest gratitude to them. I'm like, "Thank you." Like I don't, because you righted my the course that I was charting. The and I try to extend the same, or at least try to encourage this culture of celebrating wrongness. And the other addition is uh, not the best analogy, but I remember I going to a dentist who told me like, "Oh, I don't think you need a root canal," when whereas a previous dentist told me I did, and I felt like I could immediately trust this person because they told me something that was contrary to their
mm,
financial interest. It's similar to like a car mechanic that says, "No, you don't need additional work." When they're telling you something that is supposedly, at least nominally, superficially against their interest, you trust them more. And I've admitted this multiple times. The fact that I admit error so easily is something that I see as part of my what bolsters my credibility. Because if I do it consistently, you should, just like, you know, Bayesian logic, you should assume that I'm correct more often than not. If I have this like easy shoot available to me that I resort to without hesitating. So that's the part that you know, I feel like an alien when I see people struggling with admitting error, because it just feels like you're just digging yourself deeper.
yeah. But I think one of the things you said there was something like, "I don't want to be wrong," or something like that. And I
Right.
think actually, like prioritizing accuracy above all else, that itself is a kind of strange thing once you get to domains like politics and religion. Because another facet of this is not just like the reputational thing is purely individual. People feel like there are these big kind of tribal stakes at play when it comes to many of their beliefs. So if you think about like a non-political context, a religious context, think about, you know, the European wars of religion. Under those conditions, to admit that, you know, your religion's dogmas are mistaken, you know, that feels like sort of catastrophic to many people because it's
Hmm.
not just a claim about the nature of reality, which, oh, it could be true, it could be false. It's identity defining. It weds you into a
Hmm.
community, and it's how you differentiate yourself from the other people, from the other faction, the other tribe. And I think in politics, there's a lot of that going on as well, where, you know, you take a belief like the election was stolen. I don't think you should view that belief just as like, a sort of disinterested attempt to get at the truth. And if you point out that it's wrong, it's like, oh, thank you, you've given me new information. I think is identity defining for that coalition. And I think it's also a form of kind of almost mythic narrative that they use to mark themselves out, to denigrate the other side, to aggrandize their own side. Oh, of course, we didn't lose the election. The only reason it seems like we lost is because it was stolen from us, etc. So, I mean, I agree with you. If you care about the truth, and that's the overarching goal, then acquiring information that you're mistaken, you should be grateful for that. But this truth game, which we tend to play with, our media sort of day-to-day existence, I think is quite unnatural in domains like politics and religion, where people have many other motivations, many other goals, independent of and sometimes in conflict with the pursuit of truth. And that's probably
Yeah.
another thing that's going on in many of these cases as well.
I agree with you. The one question I had with regards to research is when you said someone admits wrongness, they're perceived as less reliable. Have you actually
Mhm.
seen research on the
Yeah, that's a good
perception?
question.
Because
That's
I would be curious what effect, what practical effect it actually has.
Yeah, great question. I don't know. I'm
Okay.
sure that has been studied. I imagine it's also sort of context sensitive as well, right? It
Yeah.
depends like what specific belief, but I don't know. It's a really good question.
Yeah. And some of the things you're mentioning kind of remind me. If it feels like this isn't something I can definitively prove, but it feels like some sort of crisis of resilience where put people transform their beliefs and their tribal affiliation into more of a load-bearing pillar for their being. It's
Mm.
not just something that you adopt passively within like specific contexts to facilitate interpersonal relationship, but it just becomes internalized. And I understand why there would be severe aversion to wanting to detach that yourself from yourself because it just becomes too much part of you that it's going to be painful. Um, just like brainstorming, is this something that can be potentially fixed by either discouraging people using tribal signals as a load-bearing pillar, or offering something else, like mindfulness or just general confidence in yourself as the load-bearing pillar?
Yeah, another great question. I don't know. I mean, I sort of have the intuition that a lot of people that invest their identity really central, sort of really closely into their politics and their political identity, it's partly because they don't really have much else going on in their lives, which I
Hmm.
guess is somewhat kind of in line with what you're saying. So this is used then as a source of community and a source of esteem. I don't know whether that's true. That's the kind of intuition that I have. I mean, I think what's really ultimately important is the kinds of norms that prevail in a given cultural context. And as you're saying, I mean, if we inhabit a world where acknowledging uncertainty, saying you might be wrong, learning from your mistakes and things, if those things are celebrated, if they're encouraged, then that's totally changing people's incentives, right? So they're much more likely to exhibit those traits of, and actually, this reminds me, there's what psychologists call active open-mindedness, which is when you explicitly sign on to the idea that you should base your beliefs on evidence and you should revise your beliefs when you encounter evidence against them. One thing that's really surprising is those things sound like they're kind of banal. Like, of course, everyone thinks that. But actually, if you just ask people explicitly, if you ask people explicitly, there are lots of people that I can't remember the exact figures. There's research on this by Gordon Pennycook, who just explicitly deny that they think you should form your beliefs based on evidence, or that you should revise your beliefs when confronted with counter evidence. And I think at least part of that is to do with, it's very easy
Wait,
to
they
think
they
a kind of,
explicitly deny it even when it's framed that transparently?
yeah. So there's this active open-mindedness scale where it's sort of statements like, I might even be able to find it. It's statements like, I believe I should, base my beliefs upon evidence. I believe that it's really important to take into consideration evidence against one's beliefs. And basically, the degree to which you explicitly agree with those statements determines the degree to which you exhibit kind of active open-mindedness.
Hmm.
And that's an important variable because people differ in the degree to which they sign on to those statements.
Okay,
And
that's
that's not
surprising.
that surprising. If you think about something like
Well,
religion, I mean, if you think about faith, I mean, faith is sort of, believing things in some ways when you don't necessarily have evidence. Um, but I
Well,
also
here's
think,
why I said it's surprising. It's surprising because I used to be a Muslim and I'm an atheist now, but I remember when I was at the time, I still cosplayed as
mm,
or pantomiming rational discourse by
right.
claiming that my belief was based off of evidence. And there's so much Islamic literature that purports to accomplish exactly that by citing verses from the Quran and how they affirm scientific discoveries, things of that nature. When I talk to people and I kind of can tell that they're like unreachable, they usually still try to pantomime
Yeah.
rational discourse by claiming, "Oh, I believe this because of evidence," or immediately discounting contrary evidence. But they're still pretending. It's the reason I said it's surprising is that I rarely encounter someone that speaks transparently by saying, "No, I will not consider contrary evidence." They usually try to dress it up.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think people, are motivated to rationalize their preferred beliefs by finding evidence and so on. But I also think it's true that there is just clear cultural and subcultural variation in the degree to which people actually enforce those norms. And I think there's a certain kind of, you might think of it as an enlightenment ethos that really celebrates kind of active open-mindedness and really celebrates these norms of revising your beliefs based upon evidence. And I think actually that's a very unnatural thing when it comes to beliefs outside the scope of immediate first person experience. And
Mhm.
even though you're right that if you push people on their beliefs, they'll often offer a kind of, very often very unpersuasive kind of rationalization. It's remarkable in a way that often if you find religious communities or cults or like tight knit political communities, how little interest there actually is in exposing their beliefs to possible arguments and
Yeah,
criticisms and counter evidence and so on.
that part is not surprising.
Mm.
It's there's epistemic fortresses everywhere. It's just the transparency that I noted.
Somewhere in one of Pinker's books, he quotes Bertrand Russell, who's got this quote, something like, it's undesirable to believe a proposition when there's no reason to think it's true or something. And Pinker makes the point that, that just seems obviously, why would that even need to be said? But actually, if you look at the broad sweep of human history and the way in which people have approached topics of belief in domains like religion, that is actually a kind of a revolutionary idea in some ways,
Mhm.
because it's not instinctively borne out by how people approach many topics. And there are many cultural environments where that just basic norm is kind of not enforced at all. Partly because I think they're viewing these domains through the lens of almost like primitive myths or something like that, rather than as sincere, disinterested attempts to figure out how things are.
Yeah, I agree. Um, yeah. Um, did you have any questions, or like how long can you keep going?
I can go into about 6:30, so I've got about 35 minutes at the
Okay,
latest,
cool.
but we can. Um,
Um, what did you want to talk about
Yeah, well,
on my end?
I was going to talk. So we've already touched on this, but I was reading some of your articles about your kind of despair at the at the MAGA information environment and beliefs and so on, which obviously I like really sympathise with. And I think one of your articles you call it sort of like delusion based politics or something like that.
Mhm.
Um, so I
Which
mean,
is
yeah,
very much in alignment with Iglesias crank realignment
right,
and
right.
Richard Hanania's the Gribble voter.
Yeah, yeah. So I was wondering, obviously, you've got much more immersion in that world than I do, and you actually talk to people from that world and you debate with them and so on. Uh, I mean, I don't really have that. I mean, I'm a kind of ivory tower academic in the UK, so I'm like distanced from it along many different dimensions. But yeah, I'm wondering. So, what is your takeaway of what do you think is actually going on? Because when I was reading your stuff, I mean, there's one interpretation where these people, they're really kind of trying to figure out what's going on and they're just kind of stupid and crazy and idiotic. There's another interpretation where they're not even trying to figure out what's going on, really. And if you think that, then it's not so obvious that they're being stupid and crazy and idiotic because that's not their goal to figure out what's going on.
Yes. So the first thing I guess is to acknowledge that it's perfectly rational for intelligent people to hold idiotic beliefs, and
Right.
you have to calculate that intention with other competing goals. So if holding an idiotic belief engenders you to your community, it's like worthwhile. So you can kind of like distinguish between low cost and high cost beliefs. So if you don't believe in gravity, you're going to suffer the consequences the next time you walk off of a ledge. But if you don't believe in evolution, it's not going to affect you day to day, but it might make it easier to live within a community that also doesn't believe in evolution. That part is important. That phenomenon is important to acknowledge, and it makes perfect sense. Like
Mm,
there's nothing inscrutable about that. When it comes to what else is going on, I think I should also just admit to some of the crazy ideas that I myself was contemplating. So you mentioned the 2020 election. That was a really big breaking point for me when the despair really started settling in, because I was talking to I've always been in like flowing in conservative spaces, and I was interacting within this community where there were a lot of conservatives, and they could talk about the minutia about the Sudanese war, about like the Roman Empire, about like incisive analysis of this particular event in like the 1950s, something to that effect. So I cannot say that these people are idiotic, but so many of them started parroting uh, just really, really stupid theories from Trump about how the election was stolen. Uh, I don't. We don't need to rehash that. And more. So I can't just say it was Facebook randos that had schizophrenia, but moreover, we also saw establishment figures who previously were fine. Like Rudy Giuliani I wish I could find out just like what the fuck happened to him. He was a very like well loved and celebrated mayor. He had an extraordinary career as a prosecutor, tackling the organized crime. There's it's really hard to claim that this guy is a moron. But the shit that he was saying in service of Trump's delusional theories, that really like set into despair for me, because I just thought, what is going on here? And I was
mm.
hoping that, oh, we'll find out in a few years that there's something in the water that's making everyone insane, or there's some sort of novel virus that is somehow transmitted electronically. And again, I'm admitting some of these ideas that I contemplated, and I don't have any evidence for them, but it shows you, I guess, like the depths of despair that I slunk into, because I just had not I just had no other explanation for seeing such a steep and severe decline in some of these people. So that part is still a question mark.
Mm. I mean, just to follow up on that, I think very often, I mean, I encounter this. Basically, this is the kind of uniform opinion that I'm always encountering, that Trump and the kind of coalition behind him are stupid, crazy, and so on. But as you say, I mean, you can evaluate people and their actions and their beliefs kind of epistemically, to use that philosopher's term, like, in terms of, are they well supported by evidence? Are they helping them get at the truth? But you can also evaluate what they're doing just like practically. Is it advancing their interests? And we might not like those interests, we might not like their
Hmm.
values. But is it actually helping them to get ahead? And then,
Hmm.
I always have to come back to the fact, who is president? Right? It's Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And so the idea that he's delusional and that the people backing him are kind of purely crazy or psychotic or stupid and so on, I find it difficult to reconcile with the fact that, just objectively speaking, I mean, I hate that style of politics. I can't stand Donald Trump, but he's been extraordinarily successful at
Hmm.
advancing his interests as he perceives them, and being really a fairly kind of transformative president. And I think that's
Yes.
quite difficult to
No
reconcile with
disagreement.
at least one interpretation of the idea that he's crazy. Like,
Yeah.
there's a kind of rationality here, even if it's not a
Yeah.
rationality that
So
you.
it goes back to my initial explanation in that it's perfectly rational for intelligent people to adopt crazy
Right, right.
belief. And there's obviously a severe, a very, very strong and compelling incentive to adopt whatever the person in power happens to want. There's a reward structure. So I acknowledge that that's the case. And then the follow up to that is like, is it just an effect of Trump, or has the mechanism for reward structures for rewarding bad behavior somehow increased over time. And not to give the left any pass, I'm sure like a lot of your audience will disagree with me, but I identify similar patterns when it comes to the left in terms of steep decline when it comes to the issue of Israel Palestine. And I'm not talking about having sympathy for Palestinians. I think that's perfectly valid, reasonable, and humane position to have. The part that I find very concerning is open support for Hamas, for an organization that absolutely disdains the well-being of Palestinians and is willing to sacrifice it at the altar of further destruction. That's another instance where I started feeling despair because I had friends that I knew my whole life as very educated and intelligent, and they completely stopped talking to me over this topic. And I've just seen how many people have just been completely transformed by this
Mm.
one issue. You look at some people, their social media page would be just pictures of their life, and then after October 7th, it's just nothing but Palestinian topic, nothing else. They don't discuss anything else whatsoever. It just becomes part of their identity. So, like one of the questions I wonder is that is the mechanism for rewarding these behavioral shift is that somehow increasing or becoming more accessible? Because that might explain the rise in crankery better than just the internet.
Yeah, yeah, good question. I guess I'm sort of just a pessimist in a way about the human condition and about history and things, in the sense that I think, what you're describing, but I'm certainly no expert when it comes to Israel, Palestine, and so on. But I think you're right that among segments of the left, you've got like a very simplistic, cartoonish, Manichaean picture of what's going on. But in a way, I just think that's such a common feature of the ways in which human beings think about things, and that's manifesting itself in a particular way here. But I think if you look at the past 100 years, you're seeing that basic kind of simplifying, Manichaean framing imposed on the world just recurring all over the place. And to me, it's sort of better question how you get the genuinely surprising thing, which is some people, some of the time, as a consequence, very often of specific institutions, managing to overcome those, tribal impulses, those Manichaean framings, and try to develop more kind of thoughtful, nuanced analyses of what's going on. I mean, I'm not so convinced that if you're looking at something like that, that it's so much. I mean, that specific phenomenon you might think is worse now than it was, a couple of years ago. But the thing that it manifests, which is people viewing the world in terms of very simplistic, there are the good people, there are the evil people. That to me feels like a kind of human universal that you just see
Mhm.
recurring across lots of different contexts. Um,
Yeah, one thing I've identified. Did I cut you off from an answer?
no, no. I mean, I was also just going to maybe just add one thing, which is there's sort of two things going on. One is, like you mentioned, the incentives and kind of just basic psychological dispositions towards tribalism. There's also just this other thing that I've written about elsewhere, um, which is just people not instinctively appreciating complexity, sometimes
Hmm.
wrapped up with this concept of naive realism. People thinking, the truth about these issues, even if it's a complex, geopolitical conflict or it's a systemic issue in society, they think it's just obvious and self-evident,
Hmm.
such that if anyone disagrees with them, as you're saying, like people not talking to you anymore, if anyone disagrees with them, well, they have to just be banished, excommunicated, etc. And that I'm sort of I still don't fully understand exactly where that comes from, but I think at least, I mean, there's part of it
I
is
was
to do
that's
with
exactly what I was going to
incentives.
talk about. But go
Oh,
ahead.
okay. No, go on. No, go. I'll be interested
Uh,
in your thoughts about that.
so I mean, one thing I've noticed is like there is this draw towards sloganeering
Mm,
on any political movement, but I especially notice it in MAGA, and it's again not giving the left any passes. But for example, like build the wall or lock her up,
right.
and a lot of these positions tend to be very tidy packages. And what I'm noticing is that there's a tension, I think inescapable tension between virality and nuance. It's
Mm,
so much easier for simple-minded ideas to spread widely. I mean, not only is it just uh, the packet smaller. It's just so much easier to adopt a nugget of an idea rather than try to hold space for all of this complexity. And if you, I've touched upon this in like some of my essays, but society builds a reward structure for adopting the correct ideas. If uh, deviate from that, you get punished in a variety of ways, either shaming or criminal prosecution, whatever. But we have ways to reaffirm constantly the values that our society tends to uphold. And it's easy, it's not easy, but it's always possible to short circuit these reward mechanisms to replace it with something that is simpler. So an example that I gave is I talked about the idea of moral homophones. Homophone is words that sound the same but have different meaning. And I talk about how you can have morality homophones. And an example I used is that you can be vegetarian for different reasons. One could be health reasons, and one could be because you care about animal welfare. And in most circumstances, you wouldn't be able to tell the two apart until you get to the fringe. So, for example, there might be like some new animal that they discovered that extends your life by 1 year, but it suffers horrific death in the process. The person that is a vegetarian for health reasons would be like, "Fuck yeah! Like I'm gonna eat that. I don't care about what happens." And that's when you start to see the divergence. And I ascribe that phenomenon to I talk about anti-racism, at least the history of anti-racism in the United States. And put simply, the two different races anti-racism would be you should judge people based off of their merit as individuals, and the quote unquote woke version of anti-racism is all white people are bad, all black people are impressed. Like end of story. It's so much easier to adopt the second one because the first one is just more it's thornier, it's much harder, it requires more complexity. And if you hijack the reward structure in place to reward anti-racist behavior, there's just like an efficiency argument to make. So that's kind of like the general like idea behind why there would naturally be a tension between the two.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I'll need to think about that. Come to terms with that. But that sounds interesting.
Yeah. So I guess that part of it is we mentioned persuasion, and let me know if you have any questions for me. But I don't want to dominate the conversation.
Mhm.
We talked about persuasion, and persuasion is tricky. I'm supposedly in the business of professionally in persuasion. I'm supposed to talk to random jurors in America and convince them of one thing over the other. I try to convince judges of one thing or the other. And I don't know if this is going to work, but one of the things there's like an operating philosophy that I think is perfect as a guiding lodestar, which is generally you should meet people where they are, meaning you can't really dislodge people from their values as easily as you can dislodge them from just bad reasoning. So
Mm,
if you don't care about free speech, I can't really make you care about free speech. But if you supposedly care about free speech and you follow a pathway that doesn't get you free speech, at least I have a better chance of success pointing out the disconnect. And that's generally what governs my general attempt. I don't try to change values as much as point out bad reasoning. And
right.
part of that means requires adopting, like fully inhabiting their stated reasons. And I've done this in multiple instances. So for the topic of Israel Palestine, I wrote a long essay called How to Protest Well, which is I'm going to assume that your stated beliefs are actually what they are. And here's how I would be a good pro-Palestinian protester. And I outline like everything I would do. And the implicit argument is that I don't think you're actually being honest about your stated beliefs. I did it in another essay was aesthetically different is um, there's a notion on the right in American conservatism of kind of like being the macho man, and I skewer that with vulgarity because I think they're severely deficient on that. So I call them cuckolds. I say they're fucking sycophants to Trump. Like they gargle his ejaculate or whatever. I'm very vulgar about this, but it it matches their energy and it matches directly their supposed stated beliefs. Um, that's my general. That's like one thing I've been trying. That's why like some of my writing can come off as deranged. I mean, sometimes it's just fun, but there is kind of like an intentionality behind that. So that yeah, that's not really a question. That's I'm just
No, no,
pointing it
that's
out and
yeah,
wondering.
that's interesting. Yeah, maybe one thing we could end on actually, because this was something I was interested in following up from what you were saying earlier. So it sounds like so my sense of your politics are they sort of libertarian-esque politics,
Yeah,
right? And so were you saying that you used to feel like you were more naturally at home with the Republican Party, or at least certain parts of the Republican Party, and that's changed over the past, what, like ten years or something like that?
like 6 years or so, probably. Like it wasn't really Trump was just like one thing, but it was 2020 probably was like the bigger breaking point.
Yeah, that's because when I think about the Republican Party from sort of, yeah, 10 or 15 years ago, it felt like there was a libertarian contingent that
Mhm.
was pretty influential within it, even if it wasn't the mainstream. Whereas now, that I don't really come across that at all. I guess for obvious reasons, given the
I
policies
mean, they
that
some of them still pantomime it. They'll claim to be
are.
libertarian, uh, but yeah, go on.
Well, that's what I was going to ask about. So, yeah, is it just the case that now, as a consequence of these sort of realignments and these political developments, now libertarians are just not part of the party at all? Or is it rather that the people that used to be libertarians, they still call themselves libertarians? It's just that they've somehow managed to reconcile that ideology with MAGA, which is so obviously
Yeah.
hostile to
So
libertarianism.
it's partly embarrassing for me to label myself as a libertarian because of the associations. If you think Cato Institute for when you think of libertarian, that's fine. Like I'm
Right,
largely
right.
aligned with the Cato Institute. But if you're thinking, Libertarian Party of New Hampshire, no, like they've just turned into MAGA apologists, and they're doing a lot of mental acrobatics to kind of stitch it together. And you'll see kind of like a similar ethos with a lot of I guess the dissident right, where they try to adopt the punk aesthetic and say, oh, we're the ones speaking truth to power, which just gets awkward when your like biggest booster is the most powerful person in the world. They have trouble reconciling that contradiction. And so like there's that aversion to mentioning it. And I guess to give everyone more context, the reason I would say like there was a libertarian streak within conservatism is that there was a skepticism, at least somewhat, of too much government. And so you would have Republican politicians in Georgia that would say things like, "Yeah, if the cops raid your house, you have the right to shoot them," and that was perfectly at home within the conservative ideology because there's a longstanding distrust of government. It's harder and harder to continue along that ethos when you have like the most powerful person in the world supposedly aligned with him. I think most of them still try to adopt the aesthetics of it, but I don't see like how it would be reflected within their actual beliefs.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's a kind of general political thing where people um, often, even if they have a quite strong ideological label, are actually not necessarily that strongly committed to specific ideological convictions, and they will just fit in their ideology with whatever is convenient at a given
Yeah,
moment in terms of what they're allied to and who they're loyal to. But yeah, I was interested in the libertarian case specifically because I can't imagine someone libertarian voting for the Democrats. So is it just that they're sort of politically homeless, the sort of true libertarians now within America?
yeah. I voted for Kamala Harris, and that was the first time I voted in ever. And
Interesting.
it was just like as a it was lesser evil. I don't consider her evil, but it was just so obvious in terms of like the choice between the two. I'm fully aware and cognizant of the severe failures that the Democrats consistently stumble into, especially when it comes to just like identity politics and like whatever other issues with wokeism there are. I'm very clear about that. It's just the alternative is just horrendous, and it's been affirming in terms of like the last however many months. So you kind of when you're politically homeless, you kind of just have to pick the closest thing that you can potentially advance. That ideally, somewhat, optimistically advance your value a little bit. So
Yeah.
there's no avoiding that.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm working. I'm teaching at the moment, so we better draw things to a close. Any final things you wanted to talk about or touch on?
No, I asked like a lot of questions. Anything on your end?
No, I think that was great. Yeah, I'm going to go back and read some of the things that you mentioned that you did written about in more depth. But no, this was really fun. It was good to
Yeah,
it's good to
I'm
talk in person. Well,
I know.
virtually.
I'm glad it finally happened. We can include like links in when I post this in full.
Okay, great, fantastic,
All right, cool.
cool. Good to see you. See you later.
Good to see you too. Bye.